Welcome back to Pacific Legends.
Unleashed!
Very nice.
Coming in hot.
Yeah, you are coming in hot. Second episode of Roald Amundsen. Just a quick recap on what we went over in the first episode. Basically, we talked about Antarctica and the history of it being explored. And we took a bit of a deep dive into Scott and his early life and why he ended up being
Such a piece of...
Antarctic explorer, I was going to say, but what were you going to say?
Just a
piece of work. A good guy.
Yeah.
But anyway, he went down to Antarctica on an expedition because it was a good way to advance his naval career, and maybe he needed the money, and he probably wanted to be a bit of a hero. And he took his mate Shackleton. Mm-hmm. They went for a bit of a jolly down there. Did some pretty cool stuff, some science.
Yep.
Went a wee way into the continent. Didn't really get close to getting to the South Pole, but it kind of lit a bit of a spark in him. And he came back from that, wrote a book, bestseller. But in that book, he kind of absolutely...
Took a few shots.
Yeah.
Scapegoated
old Shackleton real hard.
Yep.
So that led to them falling out pretty good. Shackleton was like, stuff this, I'm going to go to Antarctica and do my own thing, which he did. And he almost made it to the pole, but not quite.
Mm.
But all of his men survived, and he came back an absolute legend, absolute hero, which no doubt wound Scott up big time. So Scott's decided, I need to get back down there and I need to conquer the South Pole, do what Shackleton didn't, and put him in his place.
Yeah.
So that's where we left the story. And now's about the time that we should bring in another player. Good
Me.
old Roald.
Oh, Amundsen.
Yeah, that guy.
Okay.
I was going to say Roald Dahl, but...
No, well, Roald Dahl coincidentally was named after Amundsen,
Oh, what a coincidence.
I think.
Yeah.
I heard it somewhere.
Yeah, nice. In one of his books, was it?
Yeah, probably.
James and the Giant Peach.
Well, yeah, if we're going to have a chat about Amundsen, I think before we start getting into the nitty-gritty of him as a character, one of the key things to understand, just in terms of historical context, is the relative position that Britain and Norway find themselves in during this period. So Britain slaps Napoleon down in 1815.
Slap!
Your
Waterloo.
favourite battle. Yeah, Waterloo. You love it.
Mate, I love that song. Is that what we're talking about? Waterloo.
No, I was talking about your role-playing experience of the Battle of Waterloo.
Yeah, I love Waterloo.
In any case, the Duke of Wellington, the British, slap Napoleon, and that ushers in this golden age, really, for Britain. It's often referred to as Britain's imperial century from 1815 to 1915.
Loved it back then.
A bit of imperialism?
Yep.
Yeah.
The sun never sets.
Go around and just get
British
whatever you
Empire.
can, chuck it in your bag.
Yep.
It's ours now. And during this time, they added about 10 million square kilometres and some 400 million people to their balance sheet. Let's chuck them on there. So when we meet Scott at the beginning of the 20th century, Britain's still kind of in that pomp. They're riding the wave of that
Dominant.
imperial century, yeah. Cracks were probably beginning to appear, but that's nothing the might of the British Empire can't overcome, surely.
And that's because they had such a good navy, right?
Yeah, a big part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a huge part of their
Britannia
success.
ruled the waves.
Yeah. Norway, though, because Roald Amundsen is Norwegian, Norway during this time wasn't even an independent country.
Oh.
They don't gain independence till 1905, and they're really made to wait. So they sort of bounce back and forth between Denmark and Sweden. There's one period called the 400-year night, which sounds pretty
Dark.
grim. So while Britain's basically enjoying their heyday collecting countries like Pokemon cards, Norway, though, isn't firmly established, and what it means to be Norwegian isn't really clear. Mm. And that repression of a national identity over a really long time too, because it was sustained, that created the kind of fertile conditions for a groundswell of nationalism, I suppose, to develop in Norway. They were actively, publicly developing a sense of what it meant to be Norwegian.
Make Norway great again.
Exactly. Yeah. For the first time, make it great. One of the cornerstones of that national identity was a kind of mythic figure. He'd appear in folk tales and stories for children. You know, they're going to sleep and they're hearing of this character, Askeladden.
Askeladden?
Ask him. Ask the genie, I think.
Yeah. Did he ever have a lamp?
No.
And a magic carpet?
But Norwegian children would grow up listening to this chat about Askeladden, and he was a character who was always the underdog, super cunning, resourceful, and could win against all odds. And so that sort of mythic figure, I guess, gives us some idea of what Norway was developing in terms of a national character. And so in those later years of that age of romantic nationalism, it's built on a mythology of kind of resourceful daring and where the Norwegian spirit's tied really closely to nature as well, a man called Fridtjof Nansen is born.
Oh, yeah.
So before we get to Amundsen, it's important to chat about him. Nansen grew up in the snow, basically, strapping on his first pair of skis when he was about 2. He watched and learned from everybody around him, especially the people outdoors, and he'd often forego his studies to just venture into the outdoors, and he'd survive in the frozen forests on his own for weeks at a time. A British writer, James Scott, described Nansen at this time, like when he's a kid, as a mini Robinson Crusoe. He's just able to adapt and survive when everything's stacked against him.
Sounds like some free-range parenting going on there.
Yeah, I don't know what his parents were up to, but he did...
You go on your second birthday, pair of skis, see you in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, we'll see you when you're 12.
Yeah.
I think he benefited from that, though, because he was an accomplished athlete later in his life. He broke the 1-mile world record on ice skates when he was 18. So he's an athletic guy.
What sort of time are we talking there?
2 minutes?
You just made that up.
I have no idea.
Well, the 4-minute barrier for the mile was running.
Is this going to help us?
I would say skating's 3 times faster. So let's go a minute.
This is the kind of good science that people come to the show for. No, but he not only did he break the skating record, he went on to win the National Cross Country Skiing Championship a cheeky 12 times.
And the under-3s.
He knew what he was doing. And the love of the outdoors and that kind of adventurous spirit, maybe it's that reflecting the mythology of Askeladden, that results in Nansen, who, as a big, fully grown man, he leads a team on the first successful crossing of the Greenland ice cap in 1888.
And that's not easy.
No, so he's set off on his own, he's done something important, and when he gets home, he's something of a national hero.
Yes.
He explicitly refers to the myth of Askeladden when he writes about that trip. And it was in that writing that Roald Amundsen began to see his future reflected. In fact, Amundsen was in the crowd when Nansen got home. He was 17, Amundsen, and he wrote about it later. He said, "The young Norwegian skier sailed up the Christiania Ford on that calm and sunny day, his tall form glowing with the admiration of a whole world for the deed he had accomplished. A madman's work, the impossible! With beating heart I walked that day among the banners and cheers, and all the dreams of my boyhood woke to storming life. And for the first time I heard, in my secret thoughts, the whisper clear and insistent, 'You could do the Northwest Passage.'" So
Huge.
You talked about a spark being lit. Well, another spark has been lit. Amundsen now has a goal. He's got a plan. But the journey towards that Northwest Passage began with baby steps. Amundsen, prior to being 17, was born in 1872 to a family of sailors and shipbuilders. And the Norwegians are a coastal people. They've got mountains inland, so their kind of gateway to exploration and Viking plunder has always been the sea. And his family was relatively successful in their ventures on the sea, so he grew up pretty comfortable.
Would you say his family was successful in plundering?
I don't know if they plundered very much. They certainly fished a bit.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, they plundered the seas for its natural goodness. But due to the sort of comfortable nature of their upbringing, Amundsen and his 3 brothers were sent to fancy private school. Amundsen didn't really care about this, though. He didn't care much for school at all. Yeah. Much like Nansen, who would be
Much like some of your students.
Yeah, I beat that out of them quickly. But that's kind of he didn't really care for school. He just wanted to be outside. And that is the kind of classroom I like to run.
Yeah, nice.
I think if you're not going to be great, then
I always say,
don't bother.
You can either do page 154 or you can discover the Northwest Passage.
Yeah,
those are your options.
Yeah, nothing else. Save us all the trouble. So Amundsen grows up, hates school. He was apparently such a bad student that his principal didn't want him to sit his final exams. Like, he forbade it. He was going to do so badly that he'd bring the school into disrepute. He's 14, just a regular kid hating school. His dad dies.
Oh.
So that pops the balloon a little bit. His older brothers almost immediately leave home, and Roald subsequently took to spending a bunch of time outdoors, often alone. Okay. And he read a lot at this time too, and it didn't take him long, particularly because of what he was naturally interested in, to stumble across the works of Sir John Franklin.
Oh.
Your mate.
My mate.
Your mate.
Johnny F.
Dead from too much lead.
Yeah. Too much lead.
For anyone who's playing along at home, Franklin was the English explorer. Tried to crack the Northwest Passage with Erebus and Terror.
He had a good nudge, didn't he?
Yeah, he had a good crack. Certainly tried.
Got stuck in there for a couple of years.
Yeah, and then they just abandoned the ship. They wandered off. They tried to walk to Canada, I think, and just...
All 129 men.
Yeah.
Dead. From lead poisoning.
among other things.
They decided to just eat straight lead.
Yeah, well, there was evidence of cannibalism too, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, stories at least. I use the word evidence lightly. There were
I
suggestions
remember them saying they found the skeletons and they had like teeth marks in them.
in the bones.
Why were they eating the bones? I guess it's better than lead.
I guess so. And, yeah. I mean, was it definitely human teeth wrapped around the bones? Or polar bears maybe nibbled them?
Can't be sure.
Yeah. You heard it here first.
Cannibalism.
Anyway, reflecting on Franklin's writing and his experiences, pretty grim experiences, which could turn you off maybe travelling in the Arctic, Amundsen wrote, "Oddly enough, it was the sufferings that Sir John and his men had to go through which attracted me most in his narrative. A strange urge made me wish that I too one day would go through the same thing. Perhaps it was the idealism of youth, which often takes the form of martyrdom, that got me to see myself as a kind of crusader in Arctic exploration."
I wish the kids these days were more like Roald Amundsen. They just can't handle any kind of suffering.
Yeah, far from being turned off by this, he's turned on by it.
Yeah.
He's frothing at this.
Give me a blizzard.
So, inspired by that life and death and the miserable suffering of Franklin, and by the daring and triumph of Nansen as well, Amundsen, once he's a young adult, begins to scheme with a little bit more purpose. In January of 1889, so the year after Nansen crosses Greenland, Amundsen leads 3 of his school friends on a backcountry ski tour through the hinterland of Christiania, which is now Oslo, Norway's capital. And in his book, Roland Huntford describes this trip as a jaunt. Yes. He just says it's a cheeky little expedition.
Oh, summer blowout?
Yeah, something like that. A summer blowout of 20 hours without sleep across 50 miles of almost untamed country.
Oh, man. That's awesome.
But he's just warming up, and that's one of just countless ski tours undertaken by Amundsen throughout, though. But the key thing is that on each journey, he refines his technique and equipment, his attention to detail, his willingness to adapt and perfect his preparation, equipment, all of his methods means that he essentially spends his formative years building up everything that he needs, all of the knowledge, all of the skill, not just to survive in that kind of environment, but to thrive.
Sounds like he's got quite a different personality to Scott.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of contrast already popping up because that environment could definitely kill someone if you didn't know what you were doing.
Yeah.
So it would behoove you to probably spend a bit of time out in it. So while he wasn't skiing in the winter or hanging out in the forest during summer, Amundsen would occasionally do what he was actually supposed to be doing, which was attending lectures at university.
Boy.
And on one of these days in 1893, when he had nothing better to do, Amundsen heard a lecture at the Students' Union delivered by Eyvind Astrup, who was another one of these Askeladden-type figures, cheeky, succeeding against all odds. He was a long-distance cross-country skier and a devotee of Nansen and a companion of the American explorer, actually, Robert Peary.
Yes.
He was one of the first polar explorers to study, but more importantly, to then kind of use Inuit survival techniques while traveling in the Arctic.
That could be useful.
Makes a bit of sense, yeah. They are perfectly suited to that environment after millennia of figuring
learn from
out.
the people that have been there for a while.
You're onto something. And so was Peary. So during Astrup's lecture at Christiania University, Astrup made a few key points, and they were going to make a really big impression on the young Amundsen. The first point that Astrup made, first, the Norwegian ski was way better than the snowshoe, and the snowshoe was still the device often favoured by the Americans and the British. They swore by it. Like, no, it's the way to do it.
Basically strapping a tennis racket to your feet.
Yeah, and go for a wander. So it spreads out your weight over a larger surface area.
Yeah.
But no, Astrup says ski is the way to do it. Secondly, you've got to use well-trained dogs, like those used by the Inuit. This is Peary's influence coming through as well. And if you didn't, you probably weren't going to succeed.
So the average kind of like Labrador...
Yeah, I mean, in a pinch, if you've got nothing else...
Fox Terrier.
Probably take the Labrador just for companionship.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's something, we'll talk about it later, but that's one thing that maybe helped Amundsen too on his trip was that they had the dogs. They didn't have the monotony of...
Have a lot of good boys.
Yeah, they had a lot of good boys around.
A lot of doggos. Always smiling.
Yeah. So the third thing that Astrup sort of harped on about was learning from the Arctic's indigenous people. You mentioned the dogs, you mentioned the Norwegian ski, but you have to be able to learn from the people who live there day in, day out. What kind of shelter you can build, what clothing to wear, because that can as well be the difference between life and death. And Amundsen was so inspired by Astrup's talk that apparently that night he convinced one of his old school friends to go out skiing through Nordmarka through the night, just to be out in the wilderness and that kind of Arctic environment. And Amundsen was apparently standing there underneath the aurora, just smitten by the entire experience. And it's like that's where he felt at home. And
he sounds like such a good dude.
He loved
obsessed,
nature.
a little bit obsessed, but he seems awesome.
He loved nature though, and he had great respect for it as well, and just really appreciated what it was to survive in a climate like that, and that it was glorious.
I want to say big ups to the friend that just said, yeah, I'll just come for a trip through the night skiing.
Yeah, I'll watch you stare at the aurora.
In a couple of hours.
So Amundsen, as a result of that, he's got the bug. He's got the Arctic fever.
Mm-hmm.
He's so determined to explore the Arctic that he writes letters to pretty much anyone who's planning an expedition at that point. But he didn't really have the necessary experience for it and was rejected by pretty much everybody. Heaps of them gave him lots of instructive feedback, though. He needed to continue his ski training. He was a good skier, but needed more training. And he needed to learn how to drive dogs. As Astrup had said, that was critical. It's tricky, though, because Norway at that point didn't really have the kind of dogs necessary for that sort of work. They were all in Greenland and Alaska.
Yeah.
So Amundsen focused on his skiing. That's what he could focus on, so he did. He travelled deep into the Norwegian mountains to ski with a friend, or it was actually a friend of his brother, a guy called Laurentius Ørdal, and he was one of the early mountain skiers.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the time, skiing today is a recreation, a pastime, but then it was a method of transportation. But Ørdal was sort of changing that, and he prepared a special journey for them on this little training mission. They were going to be skiing across Hardangervidda, which is a cool name, but it's also a really formidable, untamed, exposed, windswept mountain plateau. And Amundsen later would write that it was a pretty good approximation of Antarctic conditions.
Yeah.
So despite Amundsen skiing since the age of 2, as the Norwegian saying goes, he was born with skis on his feet, Ørdal was so accomplished, relatively speaking, and the conditions on Hardangervidda were so unique that Ørdal described Amundsen in this environment as being comparatively unfamiliar with skiing.
Yeah, I bet you Ørdal absolutely shreds, though.
Yeah, it's just...
But that's a bit rough.
Popping powder in everyone's face.
If you've been skiing all your life and someone just absolutely bags you.
Yeah, well, I mean, he had been skiing his whole life. So if you cast your mind back to Scott...
Yeah.
I don't think he'd been skiing since he was 2. I don't know if he ever...
I think he started skiing 2 months before he went to the Antarctic.
Did he make many trips across Hardangervidda?
No.
I don't think so. So Amundsen, he's always learning. And on this trip across Hardangervidda, I just want to say it more and more times.
Sounds like something from Mad Max.
Amundsen was able to test 2 crucial elements of polar exploration. So they improved their sleeping bags, they used reindeer hide, and they used jackets with a hood attached, which was just, seems like a simple thing to do. Amundsen also learned that the skis that he was on weren't suited to that type of travel. The bindings weren't really secure enough. The bottom of the skis stuck to the snow too much.
He had powder skis on, did he? Good
stuff to know, yeah. Yeah, he had fat powder carvers.
Okay.
In the process of applying for all those polar expeditions, Amundsen was also told that he needed more experience at sea. So he joined a sealing expedition and sailed off to slaughter about 50,000 animals.
Oh, how good. I'm anti that, but...
Yeah, I mean, Amundsen was as well, actually.
Was he?
But he didn't. I don't know if he really knew it until this point.
Until he clubbed his 4,000th seal and realised my arms are tired, I'm not into this anymore.
Yeah, he cracked slightly too many skulls, and it kind of haunted him. He was practical later in life and pragmatic. Like, they definitely hunted when they were in Antarctica and built up massive stockpiles of seals and penguins. But that kind of slaughter for slaughter's sake always turned his stomach a little bit.
Yeah.
He then completed his mandatory military service, so 7 months and 5 days, and he asked the army during that time if, for his physical training, he could just take off and do a massive cross-country ski run with full equipment, rifle, everything. So he does that, and he then attempts a midwinter crossing, again, of Hardangervidda. And he applied lessons that he learned in the past to this trip, so lighter skis, bindings with more control, a lighter, more practical load of food and supplies, and navigation equipment, which he practiced with as well. And he didn't cross Hardangervidda. He actually never would.
Oh.
It was... we'll talk.
Too far from him.
Well, yeah, I don't know if he was ready yet.
Yeah.
And we'll talk later about, Amundsen later in life, and he reflects on his successes and failures. And this is one of those things that sort of sticks with him. It's always a needle in his side.
Always grinding him, isn't it?
Yeah. But, he got more experience points. He leveled up.
Yep.
He's got all the right attributes where he needs them. So at this point, Amundsen's, home from Hardangervidda, sitting down, having an OJ.
Yeah.
And flicks open the paper. On the front page, one of his old friends, Carsten Borchgrevink, who has been one of the first people to set foot on Antarctica, which he achieved on the 24th of January, 1895.
Ah, mate.
So, Borchgrevink's fizzing about this, races back, tells the 6th International Geographic Congress, which is always a rowdy bunch.
Oh, man, that must have been going off.
They were steamed. They were loving it. So they're foaming at the mouth due to this, and without really thinking at all, just immediately pass a resolution. They state, "The exploration of the Antarctic regions is the greatest piece of geographical exploration still to be undertaken. This work should be undertaken before the close of the century. Quick!"
I can hear the excitement in their voices.
Yeah, I added the quick, but otherwise that's what they said and how they said it.
Oh, man.
They were foaming.
Do you think the music was going and then this thing came in and the music just stopped
Yeah.
and it was just like...
Yeah, and then as soon as that was done, the Pacific Legends Unleashed theme kicks in.
Oh, nice.
And everyone just moshes out.
Oh, they would have been frothing.
Yeah, one person moshing out to it was Naval Officer Adrian de Gerlache. He loved the sound of this, and he managed to find an old sealing ship. He called it the Belgica, which is Belgian for...
Seal slaughter.
Yeah, seal massacre.
Yes.
And they planned to go further south than anyone had ever been. So he was flooded with application letters, and one of them happened to be from Roald Amundsen.
Get in there, son.
Yeah, and he'd leveled up, like I said. He had a bit more training and experience at sea and on skis, and due to this, he stood out from the crowd a little bit. And it didn't hurt either that Amundsen was a compatriot of Nansen, who at that moment was a bit of an international superstar.
Yes.
Because while de Gerlache was preparing for his expedition, Nansen had just sort of wandered out. He'd emerged from the ice after a full 3 years since he'd last been seen.
Just chilling.
Yeah, just been hanging out, literally chilling. It's one of the great survival stories. Well, bear with me.
Okay.
So Nansen and his mate, he had a single companion with him, Hjalmar Johansson. They left their ship, Fram, which we've spoken about a bit already and we'll talk about again soon. They'd left Fram with sledges, dogs and skis, and they made a mad dash for the North Pole. They didn't make it, Devo. They did get closer than anyone ever had been before, though. They made it to 86 degrees, 14 minutes. But it was the return journey that was particularly remarkable. They travelled over 500 miles of shifting, drifting pack ice. They ended up stranded on an icy island, breaking away from the pack, and they just hung out there, chilling, living in a makeshift icy hut. And obviously they've demonstrated, they were hard men, they knew how to survive, but they also had a sprinkling of good luck because another ship rocks up. "What are you guys doing here?"
Hey guys, what are you doing on that iceberg there?
Yeah. They're like, you're going to Norway. So luckily enough...
No, I'm loving it. Yeah, on the
we're
iceberg.
sweet. No, luckily enough, they get back to Norway and the country just explodes in this celebration of national pride and Nansen's just the symbol all of a sudden of what it means to be Norwegian and to survive when everything's stacked against them. And so, Amundsen's got Norwegian like Nansen on his resume, and de Gerlache likes the sound of that. So Amundsen's actually appointed as second mate on Belgica.
Sweet.
On board that trip as well is one guy called Dr. Frederick Cook.
Oh.
And he was an American, like Peary, who had been through North Greenland in 1892. And I don't know whether we spoke about that at all in the last episode, but it's a famous trip mostly because they used lots of those Inuit survival strategies when they were traveling.
Yeah.
So Cook had a lot of that knowledge, and Amundsen just stuck to him like glue.
Yeah.
Asking questions, paying attention to his sledges too, which they'd modified a little bit according to advice from the Inuit. And they struck up a really good friendship. Aboard Belgica, with their new friendship nice and firmly established, they sailed south under de Gerlache. And on January 26th, 1898, Amundsen was probably the first person to ski on Antarctic snow.
Nice record to have.
Yeah, pretty good. He had a little hoon around a small island called Two Hummocks. And 5 days later, Amundsen and 5 others embarked on a short sledging journey across Brabant Island. The 5 men hauled the sledges up this really steep ice sheet around crevasses, over them, and Amundsen just looked at that experience with horror. He was basically like, this is dumb.
What, man-hauling?
Man-hauling is dumb.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, especially in these conditions, steep, slippery, and why would you do it? It should just be a last resort if there's nothing else that you can possibly do. Amundsen also learned from Cook in terms of his really calm and practical manner. So while Amundsen's spinning out about all this man-hauling, Cook's staying nice and calm. He treats everybody with respect. He's solutions-focused. And so Amundsen levels up his leadership capabilities on this trip because he goes, right, that's how I'm going to do it. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Due to weather, thick ice is setting in at this point. It's late February. De Gerlache knew his initial plan wasn't really going to be feasible anymore. And he was a fan of Nansen, so one idea pops into his mind. Nansen had deliberately allowed his ship Fram to get stuck in the Arctic ice. He believed that rather than walking all that way, they could just drift. If the ship's stuck, it just drifts with the current and it'll go further north. De Gerlache wanted to do the same in the south. But he also didn't want to tell his crew this because he thought they wouldn't be that keen to sort of be stuck in the ice.
That's leadership.
Possibly forever. Yeah. I mean...
Give it the old, we're just going to head home, or are we?
Yeah. Well, Amundsen maybe takes a leaf out of De Gerlache's playbook too, and I'll come back to that later on. Anyway, De Gerlache is a bit of a weasel about it. He falsifies his measurements and observations. He's like, yeah, it's all good. We're heading north, but really they're heading south. So proper deceit. And then they accidentally get stuck in the ice.
Ooh, stuck in the ice. Oh, what a shame.
Yeah, oh no. Which is pretty rough. And Amundsen now is in a situation of potential disaster. He's stuck with an international crew, and he's always preparing, and he knew who was going to be there. He'd learned a few languages to help him communicate.
Yeah.
But it was complete, just unending darkness. And in the middle of that polar night, scurvy descends on the crew and just ravages them. De Gerlache and his second in command actually are both so sick that Cook and Amundsen step up and relieve De Gerlache of command. And, scurvy's just running rampant. One man dies, his body completely ruined. Two others actually lose their mind. One of them just leaves the ship going, I'm just going to walk back to Belgium. This is what it's going to be like. I'm walking home.
Did he make it?
It's unknown his fate. Yeah. The odds were definitely stacked against him.
He fell into the ocean at some stage.
I think he was fine. Cook had for a long time been convinced that meat was a cure for scurvy. So
let's go slaughter some seals.
Well, they'd already done a fair bit of slaughter.
Okay.
So they had some stockpiles there. But de Gerlache didn't like meat. Like
Adrian!
Yeah, Adrian didn't like penguin and seal meat. Like, he didn't like the taste. He's like, I don't like it.
Was he vegan?
So he'd banned it. No, he was an idiot.
Oh, okay.
So he'd banned the consumption of that meat. While he's out of it, though, Cook just pulls rank. He's like, okay.
It's a meat fest.
Yeah, it's going to be a sausage fest all of a sudden.
I'm sure it already was a sausage fest.
So they cook it up, and lo and behold, the crew begin to perk up. No one else tried to walk back to Belgium.
Just smashing some steaks.
Yeah, just hooking into it. And they're all good. So things get a little bit better. Spring and summer eventually allow the sun to rise again. But the ship's still trapped in ice over 2 meters thick. The worst thing about it is that open water's visible, like a few hundred meters away.
That.
So they're just looking at it, but they can't get there until they just blow all the ice up with explosives.
Why didn't they do that earlier?
Just chuck a few grenades around, and they make
them
this
all on
little
the
channel.
seals, did they?
Yeah. They made a little channel. It took them ages. It took them about a month to travel about 10 kilometres, but they did survive. Well, except for the ones who died. And
apart from that guy that walked to Belgium.
Yeah, apart from him. And they made it back to Antwerp in early November of 1899. So they didn't quite fulfill all of those, enthusiastically shouted fever dreams of the International Geographic Congress.
Yeah.
But Amundsen had amassed a wealth of experience and knowledge, like on top of what he already had, and it would prepare him further for what was to come. The funny thing about this moment of horror in the dark is Amundsen writes in his journal, it's been dark for a month, surrounded by death, disease, depression, which is common, symptom of scurvy. Amundsen writes, "The sun finishes its wandering northward tomorrow and begins its return. I will naturally be glad to see it again, but I have not missed it for one moment. On the contrary, it is this that I have waited for so long. It was not a childish impulse that persuaded me to come. It was a mature thought. I regret nothing and hope I have the health and strength to continue the work I have now begun. So while everyone around him's just dropping off,
What an animal.
struggling merely to survive,
He's
focusing on...
thriving.
Yeah, he's loving it. He's having a great time. But he just recognises it as an opportunity to learn again. So he adds a few more life hacks to his growing list. Towards the end of the journey, Amundsen and Cook take off. They test a new tent, which is great. Amundsen's now thoroughly convinced that skiing's the way to go. He tries one of Cook's American snowshoes and laughs at it.
Oh, yeah.
It's like no one would use one of those.
Silly.
Amundsen also used that time, though, to judge the people around him. So he looked at who had survived and who had cracked, and he was basically profiling everybody, figuring out like the character that he wanted on his expedition, wherever he was going. After his exploits in the south, Amundsen went to sea again. He studies for his master's. It's the next thing he has to check off if he's going to command his own expedition. And while he did this, he apparently just read everything that he could about polar travel. He made endless notes in his own journals, things he had to research further, adaptations to make to his own equipment. He was becoming a bit of a walking encyclopedia on the whole thing.
Good.
And so he began to put things in place for a polar exploration of his own. He wanted to fulfill that childhood dream of being the first to sail through the entirety of the Northwest Passage, surpassing Franklin's pretty disastrous attempt half a century earlier. His time aboard Belgica, though, had developed a kind of realistic sensibility in Amundsen. He would prepare with meticulous attention to detail. Everything was mapped out, the pitfalls, all eventualities. And to help with this, Amundsen met with Nansen to seek advice and approval, which Nansen granted. He's like, yep, go for it. Northwest Passage sounds awesome. Go for your life. And again, as evidence of his diligence, which never falters, Amundsen travelled to Tromsø to live among those hardy northern Norwegians. They were experts in travelling through those deadly archipelagos of the Arctic Circle. So Amundsen listens and learns. He borrows some money from his brother, and he had for some time believed that if Franklin had travelled with a small crew, like maybe 8 instead of 128, that they might have all survived. So he wanted a pretty small ship with a relatively small crew. Partly people Amundsen knew personally, and partly those expert seafarers from the Tromsø region. So crew assembled, they go off to test everything. Amundsen made contact with the right people. They could source him the right gear, good reindeer furs, sleeping bags, clothes, seagrass that they'd stuff in their boots to absorb sweat. All of that was sourced from the Lapps people of the Scandinavian peninsula. And for food, Amundsen began collecting pemmican, which is a delicious, lean, kind of ground, dried meat.
Is it like spam?
Mixed up with melted fat. Spam's a delicacy compared to this.
Oh, okay.
But it's a pretty highly concentrated source of nutrition. And Amundsen also works on his navigation techniques just to make sure everything's all good. And he actually meets with one of Nansen's mates who had perfected a technique to run dogs with skis. So you got your sledges.
The dogs are skiing.
The dogs are skiing.
Are they? Okay.
No, you've got your sledges, you've got your dogs pulling them, but you've also got men on skis. And he'd perfected this technique that just let it all hum. It just worked perfectly.
Yeah, that would be good.
So Amundsen now is learning from just the best of the best and how to handle dogs. Because this guy also stresses the importance of the relationship between the sled dog and driver.
Yeah.
You kind of have to view it as a partnership between equals. You can't just yell at them because they're not going to work for you. They're too proud and stubborn for that. So you got to sort of finesse it and work the situation in your favour.
Nice to the doggos.
Yeah, pretty much. Mostly just because it's interesting, I thought I'd mention as well. Amundsen's introduced to your friend, Sir Clements Markham, at this point.
Yeah.
And
he's an expert, isn't he?
Oh, he knows everything there is to know.
He probably thinks he does.
No skis, no dogs. So Amundsen tells Markham of all his plans, and Markham's like impressed by his enthusiasm and stuff. But he writes a letter to one of his mates at the Geographic Society, lamenting the fact that he just wishes a British person would do it. Yeah. Classic, foreigners.
He probably says he's not going to do it anyway. He's using dogs and skis. What an idiot.
Yeah, and he's not even English. So
he's not even man-hauling.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Anyway, their trip's ready to go, so they slip away from the Christiania docks at midnight, and Amundsen's boyhood dream, that Northwest Passage, is starting to be realised. And at sea, he runs a happy ship, and he realises that his style of command, partly modelled on Cook, works. So people were doing the jobs that needed to be done just because they had to be done, not because they were being ordered to do it. And, it's a bit of a dodgy trip through the inlets and islands of the passage, the early parts of it, but they eventually spot a sheltered cove, and it turns out to be the perfect place to stop for the winter. They park up, they make a camp, and once they've done that, they realise they're on the migration path of the caribou. Handy for slaughter.
Takeaways.
Let the bloodlust take over.
A couple of hammers.
Yeah, so they just hook in, murder as many caribou as they can.
Yeah.
And in the process of doing so, they establish pretty friendly relationships with the indigenous people of the area, the Netsilik, who are impressed by
how many caribou they've massacred.
Yeah, the pile of mounting bodies. Anyway, they trade with them, they learn from them. A couple of the locals stay aboard Amundsen's ship and translate. And Amundsen and his crew go off and perfect igloo building.
Yeah.
So again, he's just looking at this for what it is, an opportunity to learn. Amundsen would just stay out on the ice and, he practiced walking in the way that they walked and spreading weight evenly. And he also sort of focused as well on clothing because he looked at what the Netsilik were wearing and it was kind of loosely fitted. It allowed the air to circulate over the skin and through the clothes, and
crucial.
It would wick sweat away from your body rather than letting you just develop into this sweaty mess.
Yeah, the European fashion is pretty tight-fitting kind of clothes.
It was just insulating. Yeah. Like it was just keep your body heat in, but you sweat, and in the Arctic conditions that freezes, and it creates this horrible cycle.
Doesn't breathe, does it?
Yeah, it's awful. Anyway, so that was a big moment as well. And they also practice dog driving, and they're learning from the best of the best in how to do this. And he realised too, in terms of his later journeys to the pole, that he needed to limit the number of people who were going to the number that the dogs could comfortably carry. It had to be small, lightweight, it's like skeleton crew.
I could have probably told him that.
Yeah, well, if only we were there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Amundsen sets out to find the pole, and they travel more than 500 miles, and they do it in pretty good going. They don't find it, which is a real downer.
Dang.
They do prove that the magnetic pole just wanders around, though, which is good to know. But that failure to reach the pole is another thing that sort of haunts him. While he's going, he learns the technique of coating the runners of a sledge in really thin layers of ice to stop them sticking to the snow. Apparently, it's really difficult to get it right. But again, the Netsilik, they're expert tutors.
It's almost like waxing your ski, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
You have to apply it in just the right way, but it lets you just fly over the snow. So another thing that he adds to his repertoire of skills. I feel like I'm kind of downplaying this, but the end of this part of the story is that Amundsen and his crew make it through the Northwest Passage.
After all this time, after a couple of 100 years of people trying to knock it out.
Constantly trying and dying.
Cook had a crack, Franklin had a crack.
Yeah.
Amundsen just comes and is like, no worries, that was easy.
Go this way.
Yeah, I'll just hang out in winter here with my caribous.
Yeah, and my indigenous friends. So they just casually write their names into the history books, but they don't really make a big song and dance about it. Nansen's thrilled. Norway's thrilled. He returns home, and he's a real hero. But he's also hit with some pretty hefty bills at this point.
Oh, come on.
His creditors are keen to see him pay. So he travels around Europe. He speaks at some unis and fancy places, and he raises a bit of money this way. But reflecting on his success, Amundsen really just understands now that he wants more. He was a bit cut up about not locating the magnetic North Pole, so he sets his sights on being the first to locate the geographic North Pole. Yeah. But he knows his ship isn't adequate for it, it's not cut out for it. So he just goes to Nansen, hey, can I have your ship?
Yeah.
Can I have Fram?
That's fair enough.
The best ship in the world? Can I have it?
Can I borrow it?
I want it.
I might not give it back depending on how well the trip goes.
Yeah, I want it. But Nansen's a bit hesitant. He's probably got his own designs for a last glorious trip, and secretly he's scheming about the South Pole as well. But, Norway's gained its independence. Mm-hmm. Like, it's 1905 at this point, and Nansen played a pretty prominent role in that happening. He eventually just agrees. He's like, fine, you can have it. And we've talked a little bit about Fram, which means forward or onward in Norwegian. And it was a ship specifically designed by Nansen for polar exploration. So it's got a rounded hull, super thick, and obviously that withstands the pressure of crushing ice, but it also helps, when encroaching ice comes in, to lift the ship up. Mm. And so it just sits there on top of it, and they can then drift with the ice, like I mentioned earlier.
Revolutionary.
Revolutionary, yeah. It's got a hybrid propulsion system. It's got steam and sail,
it's like the best ship ever.
It's all good. Nicely insulated.
I'd just like to say that I've been to the Fram Museum in Oslo.
Oslo.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
I've seen it, or a replica of it. I can't remember which one it is. I think it might still be there.
Well, Huntford says that it's still around. You can still see it in the 70s.
Museum, yeah.
Anyway, Nansen, they meets with Amundsen, and, the ship's actually the property of the Norwegian state at this point, so Amundsen has to strike a deal with them. He also gets some money, about 75,000 kroner,
Mate.
which causes him a bit of anxiety and stress. He hated being in debt, but despite the fact that he was pretty much always in debt. But he gets it fitted with a diesel engine, which is a first for polar exploration. And he adds a guy called Olav Bjaaland to his crew, who just happens to be one of the best skiers in the entire world.
Oh, man, that's a big recruit.
Yeah, so everything's shaping up nicely until September the 1st, 1909. Amundsen opens his newspaper to find that his old mate, Dr. Cook, from his Belgica days, has reached the North Pole.
Should never have opened his newspaper, should he?
So that's a real bummer. And a little bit later as well, we hear that Peary's reached the North Pole. So
Peary and Cook.
Yeah, this is really throwing Amundsen's plans through the ringer. He's, on the face of it at least, not really deterred. But, the shine's been taken off it. He meets with Cook on his return. He's like, well done, nice work. And they chat for ages. Cook eventually just says, well, why don't you go to the South Pole? Light bulb moment. Amundsen's like, oh, yeah.
Hadn't thought about that.
Yeah,
the other one.
Oh, yeah, I'll do that. I'll do the other one. So at this point, every man and his dog know about Scott's plans. The Royal Geographic Society is just yelling from the top of every rooftop.
Scott's going to conquer the South Pole because he's British and he's a legend.
Go Britain. They're loving it. So he's constantly talking, Scott is, about how good he is and how good Britain is.
Scott's got massive chat, eh?
He does. Amundsen is the complete opposite. He delays his departure for 6 months, doesn't tell anyone that he's changed his plans. It's just like, I'm going to leave 6 months later. And he needs to prepare, basically, to make the changes. And he has to be secretive in part because Norway's new independence is kind of underwritten by Britain.
Yes.
And they're banking on Scott. They're championing him. So if he's got competition, they could easily pull the plug on that. Norway could be forced to.
Don't bite the hand that feeds you.
Yeah, essentially. And you talked about it a bit in the last episode, the idea that Scott believed McMurdo Sound was his. It's like, it's mine. I found it's mine.
Yeah.
And Shackleton... It's like, blood out your ass, mate.
Snuck in there.
Yeah. But Amundsen was a bit like Shackleton. He's like, that's stupid.
You can't own it.
Yeah, you haven't even done anything there. You turned up and walked around for a bit. But he looked at Scott's plans anyway and goes, well, like, if you're going to be that way about it, I might just go 60 miles closer to the pole and start from there. So Amundsen plans to land on the Ross Ice Barrier Shelf. He's going to make his base at the Bay of Whales, which lies on the barrier itself. So when spring comes, after they winter there, they're on the highway to the pole straight away, basically. Amundsen spends this 6-month period where he's delayed to finalise everything. He refines and perfects his equipment. He's got unconventional boots, which end up actually not working that well. But he changes lots of things. He adds oatmeal and peas to pemmican because... Previously, it wasn't super high in fibre, and even though you get a bit of energy from it, you'd probably spend half your life dropping your DAX in minus 50, squirting out onto the ice, which isn't that fun at a blizzard.
Not needed, mate.
So he's made that little adaptation as well. Orders all his clothing to be made like that of the Netzilik, seal, reindeer, wolf skins, all that stuff. And he uses aluminium lids for the gear cases. Like, everything is just stripped back, lightened. He's just attention to details through the roof. So his plan, remember, has to be a secret. The only person he tells is his second-in-command, Nielsen, because he needs to scrounge up Antarctic charts.
Yes.
One morning in March of 1910, at the height of his sneakiness, Amundsen's phone rings. It's a concierge from a local hotel. Hey, Roald, I've got a guy here, Robert Falcon Scott. He's keen to have a chat with you.
Ooh.
Amundsen's like, nah, no thanks.
Very, very sneaky.
Yeah, just declines. Apparently Scott wanted to talk about him because he thinks Amundsen's still going north.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, I'm going south, you're going north. Why don't we take sort of complementary measurements?
We're buddies.
Let's do science stuff together. Amundsen can't really look him in the eye, though, or even talk to him on the phone and acknowledge his deception. But he's definitely ready to get going. So he's prepared everything that could be prepared. He's got Fram, world's coolest ship. He's planning on making his dash to the pole, starting a full 60 miles closer than Scott. He's got one of the best skiers, and he's also added, by the way, one of the world's best dog drivers to his team, a guy called Hansen.
Oh,
So, Amundsen. So hot right now.
Probably got the best dogs as well, isn't he?
Yeah. Amundsen picks a date of personal significance, or national significance really, to slip away from Norway.
Norway Day.
Without any fanfare. Well, June 7th, Norway's Independence Day.
Yeah.
So sailing's pretty smooth. Amundsen, though, he's sort of racked by this gnawing, clawing feeling in his stomach. No one knows they're going to the South Pole still. He hasn't told Nansen. He hasn't told anyone. And he's got a crew there sailing, working for him, and he hasn't told them where they're going. So they park up at the island of Madeira in Portugal, birthplace of Cristiano Ronaldo.
Not needed.
Side fact. Amundsen gathers the crew together and he begins speaking, and everything just spills out of him. It's like the guilt sort of overwhelms him.
Hey guys, you know how we were going north?
Yeah.
We're going the other north.
It's like, yeah.
South.
He tells them it's actually opposites day. By the North Pole, he means South Pole. And they all think it's hilarious. It's silent, apparently, after he finishes talking. Like, no one says anything. But once it sort of dawns on them that they're going to be racing against the British, Bjarland, who's this world-famous skier, apparently says, "Hurrah! That means we'll get there first." Just trashing Scott and the British.
Fair enough.
Amundsen writes a letter to Nansen and he apologises for everything, basically. He's like, sorry for all the lies. He also says that he wished he could tell Scott about what happened. He didn't want to be sneaky, but he had to. So, I don't know about that. The media loved it, though. They get hold of these letters and they characterise Amundsen, as this...
Sneaky.
Yeah, sneaky guy, but patriotic, that he's challenging the mighty British Empire. One Norwegian paper writes, "With a single blow, Roald Amundsen reawakens the attention of the world. The exciting fight for the pole is on."
That would have been exciting.
Yeah, as the world's reeling from that, Amundsen's challenge, he's thrown down the gauntlet. Nansen's giggling with glee because he knows that he's met with Scott, which you'll probably talk about.
He's like, mate, you got no chance.
Yeah, why are you doing all the things you're doing? Sir Clements Markham, though, he doesn't really see what all the fuss is about. He says to a colleague he could not see how Amundsen could hope to reach the South Pole unless he has a large number of ponies on board. He may have dogs, but they're not very reliable. So Markham lying down some terrible chat.
What a battler.
On January 2nd, Thrum sails into the Arctic Circle. They made really good time. When they started, they were about 5,000 miles behind Scott and the Terra Nova, but they've closed that gap to 300. So they spend the next week heading steadily forward. They're just slaughtering seals left, right and centre, chucking them down their dogs' throats, get them fat and plump.
Yeah.
Amundsen writes they were, without exception, all big, round and fat. So they've got the dogs just where they need them. They're searching for, based on Shackleton's descriptions, this place called the Bay of Whales. And they find it on the 14th of January, 1911. They, take a break from all the revelry of being there. And Bjarland describes this occasion. He writes, "One thinks of what is to come, the hardships one is going to face, the use one will be, and if we can get there before the Englishmen, who are surely burning with the same ambitions." One day later, on the 15th of January, Amundsen and his men, fueled by that burning ambition and the thrill of competition, they're loving it, they start to unload Thrum and build their winter base. Unbeknown to them, Scott and his crew had begun unloading the Terra Nova 60 miles to the west 10 days earlier.
Ooh.
So that's where I'm going to leave Roald and his mates for now. It's plucky little Norway, newly independent, dressed in wolf skins on a funny round ship, up against the resplendent might of the British Empire, bursting into the 20th century, riding their motorised sledges.
Who's going to win?
It's 19 men versus 65. It's Askeladden versus an idiot.
Okay. So why don't I chip in here and fill everyone in on how Scott's going with his planning on his mission to the South Pole, because we've heard a lot about how well prepared Amundsen is, and it's very different on the British side. So obviously Shackleton's come back, an absolute hero. He didn't get to the South Pole. He was like 90 miles short, but he turned around and everyone survived. And people loved him for that.
It's a really good effort too, 90 miles.
Yeah.
It's unreal.
And imagine how hard that would be to be like, we're so close.
Yeah.
We've done the hard yards, but we're turning around here.
Yeah.
It's a big call to make, but Shackleton valued the life of his comrades rather than glory.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a theme throughout his life.
He was a live donkey.
Scott bases his kind of next trip on the route that Shackleton takes. He's going to start from the same place. He's going to follow his way all the way up the Beardmore Glacier, which was a pretty good way to get onto the polar plateau. And once you're on the polar plateau, it's a pretty flat run to the pole. So he's like, sweet, He makes this comment that Shackleton's nobly showed the way, which is kind of a passive-aggressive dig at the fact that you got so close, but you've done good because now I know where to go.
I'll take it from here.
Yeah, so...
Yeah. There's logic to that, though.
Yeah.
You know, following those footsteps.
That's
not
so
a bad move.
He knows that it works.
Yeah.
So Scott's kind of pretty confident that this is how close Shackleton's got. I'm way better than him, so I'll just carry on. But Scott's pretty annoyed at how popular Shackleton has become. He's pretty jealous that he's a hero and the fact that he got knighted.
Men with egos.
But one of the differences is Shackleton's got a lot of charisma, which Scott doesn't necessarily have. So there's a fair bit of jealousy going on.
Well, Scott can be, attractive when he wants to.
Well, yeah, he can.
He's got something up his sleeve.
Can. So the interesting thing, in terms of planning, Scott hasn't really done anything around polar travel, putting all his kind of time into developing this motor sledge. So if I haven't mentioned it already, Scott was thinking about different ways that he could get to the pole. He had like the ponies, which Shackleton used. He had dogs, which he wasn't a fan of.
Markham hated them.
Yep. So that was kind of like the lowest priority. He had men, which he was a fan of.
Who'd Markham.
But men not on skis, but on their feet. And then the fourth idea he thought about was, why don't we develop this mechanical sledge that can tow us to the pole, or at least tow our supplies a fair amount of the way, and then we can save our energy.
I get it.
And I respect that in Scott. Motorcar was coming into play.
Yeah.
It was kind of new technology, and he was like, maybe this can be utilised for our trip. So he was putting a fair bit of energy into developing that.
That's innovative.
But unfortunately, he wasn't putting much energy into developing of how to ski, how to use dogs, or just how to travel in a polar environment, which you think might be important if we think of Amundsen and how much effort and time he put into refining his techniques. Scott hasn't really done much of that at all.
Horses for courses.
Yep. So Scott's only really left himself 9 months to organise this expedition to the South Pole. When normally you need kind of 2 years.
Amundsen took a year.
It's long-term planning, but he's kind of left it to the last minute, which sounds pretty British. But there was this idea that, we're the British, the Navy can do anything, we'll just improvise, we'll figure it out as we go.
Yeah.
A little bit of arrogance going on. The big difference was Amundsen knew that dogs and skis were the key, but because of Scott's reluctance, he's really kind of punishing himself. He hadn't learned much either from his previous expedition. That's the funny thing, is that he's already been to Antarctica, and they did some pretty good stuff. And there was a lot of lessons that could have been learned, but it was almost as if Scott has disregarded these. An example of this is that how much food you need, how much water you need to drink, and how you navigate on snow and the visibility and things like this. And even learning from Shackleton's expedition in terms of how far you would put depots apart in distance. And it feels like Scott just kind of disregarded this.
Yeah.
Because Shackleton had used ponies in his trip and he made it 90 miles away from the pole, Scott was like, well, we can just do that. They seem to be pretty effective, so we're going to use ponies as well. So he gets himself some ponies, and he really liked the white and the grey ones as opposed to black ponies. He thought they were better in a polar environment.
Oh.
As you know, ponies and horses, they're not designed for snow because, they're very heavy.
They're not designed at all.
And they've got these hooves that just kind of...
Oh, yeah.
Very small surface area, a lot of weight going into it, so it's just going to sink straight away into there. It's going to be hard work. And there's nothing for the ponies to eat, so any kind of food has to be brought with them, right?
Yeah.
So in your head, it seems like horses are a stupid idea, but the British were into it. Fortunately for Scott, Shackleton had made polar travel sexy, right? Everyone wanted to get amongst it now that Shackleton had come back and he'd been knighted and he had a hero's parade. So the calibre of people that were applying for Scott's trip was much better than the last time. And the Navy were more open to letting the officers go this time. They weren't at war anymore, so they could get much better officers. One of his greatest recruits was this guy called Teddy Evans, and he was second in command.
Oh, he lives on Norfolk.
Yep, that one.
Yeah.
No, I think it might have been a different one.
Oh.
He was a really good asset because, A, he was a really good leader, but he was also a really good navigator. And that's one thing that you need when you're in the Antarctic. Other people to go on the trip was this guy called Apsley Cherry Garrard, which I may have mentioned in the last episode. He was on the Discovery expedition. There's also this guy called Wilson, who was a doctor. Again, he was also on the Discovery expedition. He was a good mate of Scott's.
Top bloke.
A guy called Bowers, and he had a really important job. He was in charge of all the food and all the stores. So when they went and put the depots out, that was Bowers' job to organise all that, which is a massive logistic undertaking and something that's crucial, because if you get it wrong...
Was it just him? He did it on his own?
He was in charge of all the logistical, this is how many things need to be here, and this is it, et cetera, et cetera.
I'd want a bit of oversight on something like that.
No, it's just him. And then there's this guy called Petty Officer Evans. And the interesting thing about Scott is he wanted to have people from different ranks. So obviously he was an officer and he had his officers, but he also wanted to bring some of the lower ranked Navy men along. And Petty Officer Evans was one of those. And he was an interesting character, and I'll talk about him more. He's this big unit, and he loved getting on the lash.
Yeah.
I mean, he loved getting steamed. Yeah. Maybe that's why Scott liked him so much.
I love getting unleashed.
So he's going to be a big player in the game. And the final guy is this guy called Oates. And Oates, ironically, is in charge of the horses.
Ah, he's the food.
Yeah, well, I think they must have had some kind of mix-up there, because Scott would often say, bring the oats. And he's like, I'm here, sir. It's like, no, the oats. Yes, sir, I'm here.
The horses need food. Like, we've got oats.
So they never actually took any oats with them, because, no, that's not true. But he was a soldier that joined. So he was from the army, and Scott liked this because we're representing both arms of the forces here. Mm. And the funny thing is that
they have arms.
Oates actually paid to go on the expedition.
Oh.
He paid to go on it so he could look after the ponies and the dogs. Those are some of the big characters. When Scott was preparing, as you said before, he went over and he did try and learn from some people that had spent some time in polar regions. He went and talked to Nansen. And Nansen didn't really like Scott, as you said, because Scott was saying here he was going to get to the South Pole with his motorised sledges and his ponies, and then he was going to do some man-hauling. And Nansen thought this was ridiculous, as you would, because it's all about dogs and skis, as anyone that's travelled in polar regions has learned. So Nansen told him this. He said, this is what you should be doing, and Scott kind of just ignored him. But he did buy some sledges off Nansen. Mm. Nansen demanded to Scott, you have to take skis or else you're not going to make it. And he even organised a Norwegian guy called Graham to train him on how to use skis. Nansen reckons that Shackleton would have made it to the South Pole if he was on skis.
Yeah,
so that's kind of like the chat that was going on. And again, Scott's pretty reluctant to follow his advice. Which,
denied.
This guy's done a few things. You'd think you'd learn from him.
I'm going to listen to Markham.
While he was on this trip in Norway, meeting all these people, he was amazed at how good the Norwegians were at skiing.
Oh, yeah?
It blew his mind.
Yeah, tiny little babies hooning past.
Yeah, 2-year-olds just ripping past them. He also was trialling the motor sledges in some snow, and that was going really well. So again, Scott was kind of still leaning towards, the motor sledges, we'll be able to use them, get all the way. But he did try and learn how to ski. But the whole time, the Norwegians just couldn't believe how naive he was when it came to this kind of, if he's going down there, he doesn't even know how to ski properly. Like you said, he tried to meet Amundsen. Amundsen wasn't having a bar of it because he didn't want to have to lie to his face.
Yeah.
So they never actually met face to face. So he comes back to Britain, and the Terra Nova, which is a ship, leaves London on June the 1st. It's a big, massive deal. Unlike Amundsen, everyone knew about his plan.
Yeah.
The king knew about it. It was a big national kind of celebration.
Yep.
Off he go. They talked a big game. But the Terra Nova was far inferior to the Fram in terms of design. It wasn't designed for the polar regions, and it was totally overburdened with people. Way too many people on there.
Yeah, and sledges.
And sledges, and ponies, and dogs. You know, it was pretty crowded. Teddy Evans was in charge of the ship until they got to South Africa, and the interesting thing is he was a really good leader, and everyone liked him. Mm-hmm. And Scott wasn't into that.
No,
so
get this guy out of here.
Scott took over. And once they got to Melbourne, he actually had his wife Kathleen with him. They got the telegram from old mate Amundsen saying, hey, you know how I was going to the North Pole?
It's like,
joke's on you, because I'm actually going to the South.
It's
see you down there.
Day.
And as you could imagine, Scott was not that stoked on it.
Yeah.
He was actually paralysed by it. Like he couldn't even acknowledge it. He couldn't even talk to people. he spent 10 days while he was in Australia trying to raise some more money for his trip because he's a bit lean.
I think he sent Nansen a message too, going, "Hey, can you tell me where Amundsen's going?" And Nansen just writes back, "Unknown." Which was not true, but that's what he told him. So I don't know.
So once he gets into Wellington, he finally works out that
New Zealand's the best place on earth.
Yeah, that's the big discovery.
He just stopped there.
And then he also finds out that Amundsen is actually his rival. He is going to the South Pole.
Yeah. Bugger.
So they get down to Lyttelton. They kind of quarantine all the dogs and all the ponies on Quail Island. And Scott kind of went out there to check on them all. At this stage, we work out that Oates, not the food, but Oates the person,
the man,
he dislikes Scott.
Yeah.
Because he writes to his mother that Scott didn't really like animals. And Oates also says, if Amundsen gets to the pole first, we will come back with a tail between our legs, especially after the big deal we made in public.
Yeah.
Like, they talked a massive game.
There's something to slipping away quietly.
Yeah. Another great thing happened in Christchurch. Our good friend, Petty Officer Edgar Evans, who is a very beery womanizer, went out on the town.
Yeah.
Got absolutely steamed.
Yeah.
And the bit I love about this story is he was coming back to Lyttelton, to the harbour, and he was trying to get on the ship, and he was so drunk that he fell off into the water.
And died.
Didn't die. They pulled him out. But he was absolutely hammered. Teddy Evans, not related, thought this was ridiculous. He needs to be dismissed. This guy is a loose unit. We don't want him. We're going to the most hostile place on earth. We don't want someone like this with us. And Scott obliged. He said, "You're gone."
Evans, he listened to Evans.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So Terra Nova left Christchurch and headed down to Dunedin. Scott stuck around because he had to do a bit of admin. And whilst he stuck around, Edgar Evans pleaded to him to put him back on the trip. And Scott had a soft spot for the big man. And he said, "You're back on."
Yeah. You know how I drink all the time? I won't do it again.
So they jump on the train and head down to Dunners. Imagine that train trip. Scotty and Evans. Guaranteed there's a few beers had.
Turning down on the lash.
Have another party in Dunedin. Yeah. Teddy Evans is furious that he's back. Evans has been let back in. But they load up everything onto the Terra Nova. There's 19 ponies. There's 33 dogs. There's 3 motor sledges. And all of the people. It's super crowded. So when it leaves Dunedin, it's so overloaded that it almost sinks.
Yeah. 33 dogs isn't that many dogs. Amundsen's got 110.
Yeah. I mean, the dogs are just, last resort. He's got the ponies, he's got the sledges, and he's got the legs.
Just there to play fetch.
On the way down to Antarctica from Dunners, there's a few storms, as you expect in the Southern Ocean, and Terra Nova gets pretty smoked. They had this pump that was pumping out the water, so any water that came in, they'd pump it out. But the pump was defective, and they knew it was defective all the way from Britain. They knew it wasn't working properly. But they didn't bother to replace it or spend any money on it. They spent all their money on sledges and stuff and didn't bother replacing the old one crucial piece of equipment, the pump.
The decision was defective.
And at one stage, Terra Nova stopped moving completely and they were in dire straits. Luckily, Teddy Evans got in there and sorted it out. Apparently, Scott was useless. His leadership kind of failed him at this stage. And they used a bucket chain to bail out the ship. So the farm was amazing, got all the way down to Antarctica, no worries, but Terra Nova was an absolute shambles.
Oh, they would have loved it though. The British loved the suffering.
Yeah, apparently, but 2 ponies and 2 dogs die in one of the storms, but everyone else survived. But people say they were pretty lucky. Men thought that Teddy Evans did such a great job, they would cheer him, and that Scott was not into.
No.
A lot of jealousy going on.
Yep.
But, I mean, to his credit, they got to Antarctica and Scott named this Cape Evans, which is now Cape Evans, after Teddy Evans. Mm-hmm. So that was nice.
Yeah, little gesture.
So they finally make it down to McMurdo Sound. They've made it to Antarctica, and we've basically set up our ultimate showdown. We've got the British over here, McMurdo Sound. You've got
a few red flags along the way.
Yeah, things aren't going as smoothly as they would have liked, but they've made it.
They're there.
They're there.
Yep.
And over on the other side in the Bay of Whales, they've got Norwegians who seem very well prepared.
Frolicking around on the snow, slaughtering.
And I guess now we're going to see is who is going to win in the race to the pole. Pacific Legends.
Unleashed!